I will begin just by making a few brief announcements and remarks before we get to the speaker tonight. And I wish you a good evening or wherever you are. I know we have registrants for tonight's program from across the United States and Canada and in Europe and Armenia and in Australia. So wherever you are, whatever the time is, whatever day it is, in fact, welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I am the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. And I would like to, first of all, express our thanks to the Society for Armenian Studies and its president, Bedros Dermatosyan, for co-sponsoring tonight's program and for their ongoing collaboration on lectures and programs. NASR and the SAS are two organizations that are absolutely committed to and focused on advancing scholarship on Armenian subjects. It's not something these organizations do in their spare time. It is fundamentally why they exist. And I must add that they only exist through your support, and that includes your financial support and membership. So please look into being a supporter and a member of NASR and the Society for Armenian Studies if you are not already. I want to mention a couple of other upcoming programs that will be occurring over the next week. It's a very busy time of year. If you're in the Boston area, on Sunday, November 7th, at 2 p.m., there will be an in-person program called Barbara Plus Two, celebrating the life and talent of Barbara Bajoyan at the Armenian Cultural Foundation in Arlington, Mass., which will feature staged readings of two plays by the late Barbara Bajoyan. The program is sponsored by the Armenian Cultural Foundation, the Armenian International Women's Association, and NASR, and the video for the program will be posted on NASR's YouTube page after the event. On Monday, November 8th at 12 noon Eastern Time, Artsakh Baglarian, State Minister of the Republic of Artsakh, will be in conversation with Dr. Anna Ohanyan of Stonehill College in Massachusetts. This program, which takes advantage of Mr. Baglarian's presence in the Boston area, will be sponsored by the Nasser Galust Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary issues. And on Thursday, November 11th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, the book launch of Vartan Mathiosyan's new publication, The Politics of Naming the Armenian Genocide, Language, History, and Medziagern, featuring the author, Vartan Mathiosyan, and a roundtable discussion with Talar Shahinian of the University of California at Irvine, Bedros Dermatosyan of the University of Nebraska, and Mark Mamagonian, currently speaking. This program is co-sponsored by the Society for Armenian Studies and NASR. Please join us. In addition, on Saturday, NASR's 67th Annual Assembly of Members will take place online via Zoom, starting at 1 p.m. Join us to hear about NASR's ongoing work in support of Armenian studies and hear a talk by Dr. Khachig Muradian, the Armenian and Georgian area specialist in the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress, entitled From Illumination to Digitization, the Armenian Collections at the Library of Congress. Registration is limited to NASR members only, since voting will be taking place. So if you are a NASR member, please register. If you are not a NASR member, what a good time to become a NASR member. Please look into that and contact us online to do so. Tonight's program is also being offered as part of the NASR Galust Gulbenkian Foundation series on contemporary Armenian topics, and we thank the Gulbenkian Foundation for their continuing support of our contemporary issues programs. Thank you very much. Now, it is a great pleasure to have with us tonight our speaker, Dr. Artyom Tonoyan. Artyom is a sociologist and a research associate at the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. His articles have appeared in Demokratizatsiya, the Journal of Post-Soviet Democratization, Society, and Modern Greek Studies Yearbook, among other outlets. He has been a frequent guest on the BBC, Deutsche Welle, France 24, and other outlets. He is currently working on a book charting the social, historical, and religious backgrounds of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, something we eagerly look forward to seeing in, we hope, the not too distant future. He is a native of Gyumri in Armenia and received his PhD from Baylor University in Texas. I've been fortunate enough to know Artyom for some years now, and I'm very happy to be introducing him as a speaker for the first time. He will be talking about his new publication, Black Garden Aflame, the Nagorno-Karabakh Conflict in the Soviet and Russian Press, just recently published by Eastview Press. The book is available through Nasser's online bookstore, and I encourage you to buy a copy of Artyom's valuable work, which presents in book form for the first time in English some of the most important Russian language material that has appeared from 1988 to the present on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We will now hear from Artyom, and I invite you to submit questions relating to tonight's topic using the Zoom Q&A function, and following Artyom's talk and our discussion, we will take questions from the audience. Thank you, and Artyom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and I would like to thank you personally. I would like to thank Nasser, with whom I've had a relationship going back to 2007 when I was a graduate student. I was learning the tropes and such, and I would like to thank Society of Armenian Studies with apologies for my lapsed membership, which I promise to renew soon. And I would like also to thank the Galveston Belkan Foundation for presenting this opportunity, all of you combined, to talk about the book, which I hope, I think is a worthwhile project and an important project, and I hope it will bear some important fruits, and it will aid researchers, students, graduate students, or the general reader that may be interested in the topic. With that having gotten out of the way, I would like to read from the introduction of the book as I set up the problem and why the book is important, and we can open the floor for questions henceforth. So after Azerbaijan, with Turkish support, began a military offensive to retake Nagorno-Karabakh in September 2020, the Russian President Vladimir Putin was silent for 10 days. Finally, he appeared in an interview with the TV channel Russia 24 on October 7. Calling the unfolding war a great tragedy, Putin reminded the viewers that a combined 4 million Armenians and Azerbaijanis live in Russia, adding that Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Nagorno-Karabakh are all territories inhabited by people who are not strangers to us. If this statement was meant to convey that Russia was worried about the conflict, it certainly achieved its goal. But perhaps more than that, Putin's primary message was that Russia, interested as it was in tranquility along its southern borders, was not going to interfere in the conflict militarily on the side of its regional ally, Armenia. He would make this much clearer further in the interview by pointing out that although Russia has treaty obligations with Armenia, both within the framework of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, as well as a mutual treaty, these obligations have a limited scope and mandate. They can be activated if and only if Armenia itself comes under attack. Since the military operations were happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, a region internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, Russia, and by extension the CSTO, could not get directly involved, despite their concerns. In short, Russia was loath to put its finger on the scales, one way or another. For those in Armenia, it was a vexatious development, if not altogether catastrophic. To many observers of the region, Russia's actions, or lack thereof, were difficult to decipher, presenting as it were a giant puzzle. But it need not be so. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is one with which Moscow is intimately familiar. It has loomed large in the Russian language media and general discourse since it exploded into the public consciousness in 1988. A harbinger of the rising nationalist tide across the Soviet space, it accelerated the irreversible political processes that would bring down the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, for Western analysts, the fact that Putin was citing the letter of the law after Russia's annexation of the Crimea and the chaos wrought by Russian paramilitaries in Ukraine's Donetsk and Lugansk provinces was markedly cynical. The leader of the country that was responsible for the greatest interstate security crisis in the European continent since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, to quote Gerard Toll, the argument went, had seemingly just discovered international law. Putting aside Putin's obfuscations, many wondered what were the real reasons for Russia's reluctance to intervene. Was this hesitancy Putin's way of punishing Armenia's fiery revolutionary leader Nikol Pashinyan for prosecuting former Armenian President Robert Kocharyan, a rumored close friend of Putin's? Was this a retaliation for Armenia's perceived westward geopolitical reorientation? However improbable this was given Armenia's long economic, political, and military dependency on Russia. Alternatively, was this a reprise of the century-old Russo-Turkish, read Bolshevik Kemalist political dalliances that effectively carved the South Caucasus into its present form? Others wonder still whether this was a sign of Russia's growing awareness of its own limitations, meaning that its reluctance to help a friend in need was, in reality, a reluctance to spread itself too thin militarily. After all, Russia's Syrian adventure is not exactly a cause célèbre in the country. Perhaps Putin was simply caught by surprise. The truth, as it often does, lies quite likely somewhere in the middle and contains elements of all those factors in their varying shades of gray. Yet one thing that can be safely argued is that far from being wholly subject to Putin's whims, Russia's engagements in the South Caucasus and in Nagorno-Karabakh are not as ad hoc as they seem at first glance. The Caucasus is hardly new in the Russian imagination. As political scientist Robert Nalbandov has noted in his book on Russian foreign policy, the South Caucasus has traditionally occupied a significant place in Russia's vital national interests and its identity. Caucasus had always some sort of a mysteriously romantic attraction for Russia. Its greatest poets, Pushkin, Lermontov, to name a few, wrote their best pieces here. Yet to anyone unfamiliar with South Caucasus regional conflicts or Russian foreign policy along the vector in the age of Putin, this latest Russian maneuver may indeed seem rather whimsical and desultory. Nevertheless, for those paying close attention to the region, it is anything but. True, Russia appears to lack a neat, standard blueprint for tackling various conflicts on its periphery. The Abkhazian and South Ossetian conflicts were dealt with much differently, as Russia had no qualms about putting one finger on the scales and a few in the cookie jar, as it were. In those instances, Russia did not hesitate to demonstrate support for its clients. However, the fact that Russia addresses different conflicts in different ways does not necessarily mean it lacks either a strategic vision or the ability to execute strategy effectively. Insofar as the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is concerned, far from being original or exceptional or even provocative, Putin's decision-making is rather prosaic in its cold pragmatism. In fact, it can be safely situated within the logic of Soviet and now post-Soviet Russian views on how the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict should be resolved. As Moscow's leaders have stated frequently since the late 1980s, any solution to the conflict must be acceptable to both sides. The question then becomes, what is a solution or the solution acceptable to both sides? Or is this merely a diplomatic doublespeak for what is acceptable to Russia and its long-term security interests in the region? To come to a reasonable answer, a brief historical excursus into the origins of the conflict and the peace negotiation is in order. On March 1, 1988, Soviet readers woke up to yet another set of grandly trivial and inconsequential headlines from Pravda's front page. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was headed to Yugoslavia. Soviet farmers were doing their utmost to contribute to the welfare of the fatherland. Yes, the economy was struggling, yet the country's economic foundations were solid. And in case anyone was curious, the Central Committee of the Communist Party was sending its heartfelt congratulations to the newly elected Secretary General of the Communist Party of Spain, Julio Anguita. Buried in the headlines on page 2, at the very bottom of the page, was a 4-sentence news item from the Azerbaijani industrial town of Sumgait. Here, according to the vaguely worded report, certain hooligans had done what many hooligans are wont to do. They disturbed the town's peace. According to the report, on February 28 in Sumgait, Azerbaijan SSR, a group of hooligan elements provoked riots. There have been cases of outrage and violence. Measures were taken to normalize life in the city, ensure discipline and public order. An investigation by the law enforcement organs is underway. Unquote. If the prominence given to the report was any indication, the situation did not appear to be dire. This effort by Pravda to uphold the status quo, however, failed, as the subsequent chain of events would demonstrate. What the editors of Pravda did not suspect, and what their readers could not imagine, was that one of the most consequential events in the history of the USSR had just taken place. What was initially thought to be a stress test of the system, in the form of a minor set of localized ethnic grievances, evolved into a regional interethnic crisis, and at the most inopportune of times. These grievances, managed or rather repressed for nearly 7 decades, were now shaking the very foundations of the empire, exposing its structural weaknesses and a very real policy void in the center's toolkit for addressing interethnic conflict. No amount of sloganeering would be able to contain the emergence into the open of radicalized nationalist groups. The much vaunted Soviet concept Druzhba Narodov, friendship among peoples, was on its way to being empirically falsified, in the process mortally wounding a geopolitical superpower. There was certainly an element of irony in all of this. Events that would destabilize the country happened not in Moscow, but in a faraway Trans-Caucasus town that was barely visible on the Soviet map and entirely absent in the cognitive map of Soviet citizens. Not known for anything spectacular, or for that matter, anything in particular, Sumgait would become associated with pogroms and wanton violence, where official estimates recorded that 32 Soviet citizens, most of them ethnic Armenians, were murdered. Although unexpected, the unrest in Sumgait did not happen in a vacuum. If anything, it was the antithesis to the months-long peaceful demonstrations in neighboring Armenia and Stepanakert, the capital of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. There, taking advantage of Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika policies, a group of Armenian intellectuals with roots in Nagorno-Karabakh had begun a coordinated campaign to redress what they had considered a historic and historical injustice, the transfer of overwhelmingly Armenian-populated Nagorno-Karabakh under Azerbaijani jurisdiction by Stalin soon after the Sovietization of the region in 1921. The reversal of that fateful decision was the paramount aim of the campaign. What started as the efforts of a few soon ballooned into a nationwide mobilization, with masses of Armenians pouring into the streets, forcing a response from the Kremlin. The Armenian demands were largely motivated by 2 overarching grievances, economic and cultural. They argued that the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh was subject to myriad discriminatory economic, demographic, and cultural policies that had the ultimate goal of either driving the Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh or reducing their numbers enough to preclude any future Armenian claims to the region. The current leader of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, acknowledges the consequences quite openly. As reports of rising tensions in Nagorno-Karabakh continued apace, CPSU General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the working people and peoples of Azerbaijan and Armenia, quote unquote, in an impassioned plea that quoted famous Armenian poet and victim of Stalinist purges Yerishe Charents and Azeri poet Samad Vurgun. Gorbachev implored Armenians and Azeris to display, quote, to display civic maturity and restraint, to return to normal life and work, and to maintain public order. But by then it was already too late. The Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh had already upped the ante on February 20, 1988. Everything indicated that there was no turning back to their demands. On that day, the NKO Soviet, in an unprecedented move, formalized their demands by passing a resolution calling for unification with Soviet Armenia. Blindsided and enraged by the decision, Moscow displayed a swift but also almost cartoonishly Soviet reaction, where altiloquence and bombast stood in for policy. Perhaps nothing could illustrate this point better than the February 24, 1988 declaration by the CPSU Central Committee regarding the developments in Nagorno-Karabakh that appeared on the pages of Pravda and Izvestia. Quote, after reviewing information on the events in Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Province, the CPSU Central Committee believes that the actions and demands aimed at a revision of the existing national territorial structure are at variance with the interests of the working people of the Azerbaijan and Armenian republics and harm relations between nationalities. Consistently guided by the Leninist principles of nationalities policy, the CPSU Central Committee has appealed to the patriotic and internationalist feelings of the Armenian and Azerbaijani population not to succumb to provocations by nationalistic elements and to strengthen in every way that great asset of socialism, the fraternal friendship of Soviet peoples, unquote. Mere days after Central Committee's declaration, violence broke out in Sumgait. The pogroms against the Armenians were shocking in their brutality and led to the exodus of the town's Armenian population. Their muted coverage in the Soviet press and the lack of transparent investigation would in turn raise the stakes, feeding into Armenian fears of a new genocide against their ethnic compatriots in Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan proper. If there was any hope, however faint, to resolve the conflict by peaceful means, Sumgait shattered them unceremoniously. More than the shock of what transpired, however, Sumgait portended that violence as a method of conflict resolution was a useful tactic. The ghosts of the past, long thought buried, were once again haunting the land in search of new victims. Succeeding events only served to confirm these fears. A second anti-Armenian pogrom, this time in Azerbaijan's second largest city, Kirovabad, now Gyanja, in fall of 1988, then the massacres of the Armenians in January 1990 in the capital city of Baku, followed by the reciprocal and violent expulsion of Azeris from Armenia, became the death knell of the peaceful coexistence of the two communities. In retrospect, the events of 1988-1990 led both Armenians and Azeris to believe that armed conflict between them was inevitable. These events also fundamentally redefined the centuries-old interethnic relational dynamics in the region. With the so-called population injuring of 1989-1990, the stage was set for a larger confrontation, which was only a matter of time given the rapid nationalist mobilization in Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan. Moscow, after first losing the thread, was now losing the plot. The Armenian-Azeri confrontation had become a tragedy that was writing its own libretto. What started out as a localized violence in peace was first fast turning into a violence in war, propelling itself with an unmanageable inner logic toward an all-out war and ever greater human misery. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Moscow's influence over the conflict dynamics diminished as Russia turned more or less inward, seeking to solve its many domestic problems and deal with many new foreign policy challenges that would account for its weakened international standing, but not for long. If observers thought Russia was putting its backyard on the back burner, they were soon to be proven wrong. Mistaking regrouping for withdrawal, many thought that Russia would soon abandon the South Caucasus. But Russia was merely performing a foreign policy recalibration, one that would allow Russia to continue project power in its near abroad, despite the creeping overture of outside actors, or even because of them. Russia was determined not to acquiesce to second-tier status. Meanwhile, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh continued to destabilize the region and distort the internal politics of both Azerbaijan and Armenia. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of independent Armenia and Azerbaijan transformed what was a badly managed internal Soviet matter into a badly managed international one, broadening the pool of interested parties and opening the doors for the involvement of international organizations and peace negotiations and conflict settlement. Awash with deadlier and more potent weapons abandoned to Armenia and Azerbaijan by the withdrawing Russian troops, what was once a Soviet monopoly soon became an international liability. Gone were the days of a conflict waged with angry shouts, stones, and hunting rifles, giving way to the technological and destructive scope of a modern war. Larger weapons brought larger body counts, among them hundreds of civilians in places like Khojalu and Maragha, where Azerbaijani and Armenian civilians respectively were killed by advancing troops. Although Azerbaijan enjoyed both quantitative and qualitative advantages in terms of weaponry and personnel, it would be unable to turn these advantages into battlefield success, plagued as it was by internal political divisions. Poorly planned and executed military operations all but nullified their military gains of 1992, allowing Armenian irregulars and more former military units to turn the tide of the war by the following year. By the spring of 1994, Armenians had taken nearly full control of the former territories of Nagorno-Karabakh, except for Shamian district, including seven Azerbaijani regions either partly or fully adjacent to the region, and the strategically crucial towns of Kelbajar and Lachin. Exhausted by the cascading defeats on the ground and fearful of continuing political instability and social unrest, Azerbaijan sued for a Russian-brokered ceasefire in 1994. Although fragile, the ceasefire would largely hold for the next 2 decades, with occasional cross-border skirmishes along the line of contact throughout Nagorno-Karabakh and on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. International mediation efforts, led chiefly by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, Minsk Group co-chairs representing Russia, the US, and France, tried unsuccessfully to bring the conflicting parties to the table to negotiate a lasting peace. Although these efforts were successful in managing, or rather freezing, the conflict, a stable peace based on reciprocal concessions would remain a distant dream. In a sense, the closer the parties got to a resolution, the further it receded, bringing to mind a passage from Franz Kafka's The Castle, in which the story's protagonist, Kay, endeavors in vain to reach the eponymous castle. Quote, "So he set off again, but it was a long way. The street he had taken, the main street in the village, did not lead to the castle hill. It only went close by, then veered off as if on purpose. And though it didn't lead any further from the castle, it didn't get any close either." The positions of the conflicting sides, diametric opposites since the conflict first began, only became more ossified over time and more entrenched, a Venn diagram with little to no overlap. Armenia, victorious in the war, maintained that any agreement that did not acknowledge the independent status of Nagorno-Karabakh was simply out of the question. Azerbaijan, meanwhile, insisted that its territorial integrity and sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh were non-negotiable. The emergent status quo, dubbed "no war, no peace," can only be described as a slowly intensifying dynamic tension. It was only a matter of time before the tension gave way to a full-blown armed confrontation. Unhappy with the status quo and flush with a windfall of oil revenue, Azerbaijan began amassing an impressive array of sophisticated Israeli, Turkish, and Russian weapon systems with an eye toward changing the facts on the ground. Increasingly belligerent and dismissive of Western mediators, the government of Ilham Aliyev first tested the waters in 2016 in what came to be known as the 4-Day War. As a result of this rapid conflagration, Azerbaijan managed to claw back a sliver of its former territory, a strategic height overlooking Armenian positions. The most violent incident since the cessation of hostilities in 1994, led to the deaths of hundreds of combatants on both sides. In essence, it was a reconnaissance by fire initiated by Azerbaijan to test the battle readiness of its troops and streamline command and operational capabilities of its army. it was also a prelude of what was to follow in the fall of 2020. If the results of the more recent Karabakh war are anything to go by, Azerbaijan and Armenia drew qualitatively different lessons from the 2016 conflict. The 4-day skirmishes were also Azerbaijan's loudest ever disavowal of the status quo. It was no longer tenable. Accordingly, if there were no meaningful international pressure on Armenia to concede territories, Azerbaijan was willing to take matters into own hands, by fair means or foul. Despite the violence and Azerbaijan's threats, both vocalized and tacit, to resort to violence-based means of conflict resolution, along with the growing arms race between the two countries, international diplomatic efforts continued in the same vein as before. They consisted largely of sterile declarations and ineffectual finger-wagging, and in the best traditions of polite diplomatic equivocations, instigators would remain unnamed. Meanwhile, cross-border clashes were becoming increasingly frequent, deadly, and ominous, a harbinger of things to come. In April 2018, exactly 30 years after the launch of the Karabakh movement, mass protests once again gripped Armenia, recalling the heady days of the late 1980s. This time around, however, what the protesters were demanding redress for was not the legacy of Stalin's penstroke transferring Karabakh to Azerbaijan, but the legacy of, quote, authoritarianism, corruption, emigration, and injustice, unquote, that had plagued Armenia under the leadership of Robert Kocharyan and Serge Sargsyan. Led by the mercurial opposition MP Nikol Pashinyan, Armenians took to the streets in unprecedented numbers. Within days of the protests, President Serge Sargsyan, or rather the Prime Minister Serge Sargsyan, would resign, paving the way for snap parliamentary elections and the installation of Pashinyan as Armenia's new prime minister. The Velvet Revolution, as this change of rule in Armenia would subsequently be dubbed, apart from changing the political climate inside Armenia, brought to power a new breed of political actors, long outside the country's traditional power structures, who were keen on shaking up, albeit cautiously, Armenia's long-term foreign policy objectives. To distinguish themselves from the government of Serge Sargsyan, whom they toppled, these new, more or less Western-oriented elites claimed to derive their legitimacy not from Moscow, but from the Armenian people. A large claim, but one that seemed empirically verified by the mass protests in support of Pashinyan and the subsequent results of the snap elections that cemented their assumption of power. Although Pashinyan came to power on the promise to reform Armenia's political life and sagging economy, the results left much to be desired. Reform often meant a badly concocted mix of populist sloganeering, some democratic initiatives and clearly some undemocratic ones, and made for TV arrests of long-feared politicians and oligarchs, which would prove popular and electrifying. Emboldened by this newfound confidence and a mandate from the people, Pashinyan subsequently set out to tackle Armenia's foreign policy elephant in the room, the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh with neighboring Azerbaijan. Having long criticized the negotiating stance of Armenia's earlier governments, Pashinyan set out to rewrite the script of the negotiations, without, however, jettisoning the OSCE Minsk Group framework, but lauding its importance. Furthermore, he insisted that any negotiated deal must be equally acceptable to both Armenians and Azerbaijanis, something that previous governments were loath to voice publicly, especially in the wake of the 2016 war. Thus, his initial overtures to Azerbaijan were received positively, but ever so cautiously, pending further actions on Pashinyan's part and further developments within Armenia and to a degree within Azerbaijan. These would come soon enough. Looking to quote-unquote democratize the negotiations, Pashinyan first attempted to shake them up by insisting on bringing Nagorno-Karabakh to the negotiating table, citing the fact that he himself had not been born nor held an office in the disputed region, and therefore he could not speak on behalf of its population. Soon thereafter, Pashinyan would commit perhaps the biggest unforced diplomatic error of his early career as prime minister, providing Azerbaijan and its allies fresh grounds for a renewed diplomatic onslaught. During a speech delivered at the opening of the 2019 Pan-Armenian Games in Stepanakert, he would, with characteristic bombast, declare, quote, Artsakh is Armenia, period. Although he would later try to play down the remarks, the reaction in Baku and from diplomatic quarters were unforgiving. Next came the brief but bloody crossbar border clashes in July 2020 near the Armenian village of Movses in Tavush province, where Azerbaijani troops tried unsuccessfully to take over an important military outpost overlooking essential roadways and a network of Azerbaijani frontline trenches. These clashes killed nearly 2,000 Armenian and Azerbaijani soldiers and high-ranking military officers, among them popular Azeri General Polat Hashimov, causing mass demonstrations in Baku with protesters demanding all-out war against Armenia. The intensity of the clashes, coupled with the unprecedented protests in Baku that saw the ransacking of the Milli Mejlis, or the National Assembly building, served as an unmistakable indication of the inevitability of the 2020 war, and served indeed as its prelude. The diplomatic efforts in the wake of the skirmishes were no different from the routine, sterile, and largely featherweight declarations of the previous 2 decades, a fact that readily admitted by Richard Hoagland, the former American diplomat and US co-chair of the Minsk Group. The widely shared, though not as widely discussed, belief was that only a war would finally settle the problem of Nagorno-Karabakh. The war of fall 2020 was the actualization of that belief. It remains to be seen, however, whether the conflict is settled or whether the current iteration of the peace also has an expiration date. Given the new realities on the ground and the increasing Russian presence in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, this is the stuff of augury. So, now, why this book? The South Caucasus is not the center of attention in Western media, to say the least. The occasional coverage of the region falls largely into 2 categories. Tourism, more often than not commissioned advertorials by local ministries of tourism, or war, as in the case of Georgia, South Ossetia in 2008. When it comes to the South Caucasus, quote, journalism largely consists in saying Lord Jones is dead to people who never knew Lord Jones was alive, in the words of the inimitable G.K. Chesterton. People usually do not know or perhaps do not care about the region until and unless something of note takes place. In general, it's something of a blessing to the Western audience when Russia is involved, in which case a ready-made geopolitical framing of the issues of concern can be pulled out of the drawer and given a new shine. Such a verdict may sound overly dolorous or unduly cynical, with apologies to those tireless journalists who risk life and limb to cover the region in times of profound crisis for little personal gain. But it may not be that far from the truth. This is another way of saying that Western journalistic interests probably match the general or even the precise contours of Western geopolitical interests in the region. Be that as it may, Russian media's footprint in the region has been far larger and far deeper, if not more storied. The point made here does not mean that it was better, but that it was more, infinitely more. As such, the output of Soviet and Russian journalists on the happenings in the region in general and on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in particular is a veritable mountain next to a veritable molehill. We can only hope that the book the reader is holding will prove to be a worthy Sherpa as the reader tries to climb that mountain. As we wrote above, Russian knowledge of the region is as vast as it is intimate. It is with this intimate familiarity in mind that Eastview Press has made available to specialists and general readers alike this carefully selected, translated, and edited collection of articles that have appeared in the Soviet and the post-Soviet Russian media since the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict first began. The goal of the book is to provide both the broadest and deepest context of Russian understanding of the conflict as it has been dissected, litigated, and relitigated on the pages of the Soviet and Russian press. To be sure, there is no such thing as the Russian view of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. There are and always have been multiple views on how to settle it, depending on the political and increasingly geopolitical winds blowing in the region. Moscow has at times favored Yerevan and at other times Baku, but in all circumstances it has favored Moscow, to no one's surprise. When presenting such a collection, the immediate question that needs answering is, what is so special about the Soviet and Russian press coverage of the conflict? The importance of the Soviet and Russian press coverage can be summed up perhaps, in the words of Bernard Cecil Cohen, an American political scientist and a media theorist, when he wrote way back in 1964 about a different war, the war in Vietnam, that the press is significantly more than a purveyor of information and opinion. It may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about. With this in mind, it is our purpose to introduce to readers the most comprehensive press coverage of the conflict, apart from the press in the conflicting countries, hoping the readers will learn and study the entire range of the issues that Soviet and Russian commentators, analysts, and politicians considered worth examining and commenting upon. In short, what people should both think and think about. More than anything else, we envision our book, Black Garden Aflame, to be a ready-made tool for historical, political, and social analysis for scholars and historians specializing in the late Soviet period and the South Caucasus, as well as students of nationalism and ethnopolitical conflicts. Divided thematically into 4 parts and consisting of 14 chapters, each in turn chronologically structured, the book begins with the first stirrings of what political scientist Mark Basinger has called nationalist mobilization in NKO and the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. It moves from the heady days of the Karabakh movement to the counter demonstrations in Azerbaijan, to the anti-Armenian violence that broke out through the Azerbaijani cities, setting the stage for the unraveling of the Soviet Union. Part 1 also covers early Soviet efforts to manage the conflict, which resulted in the emergence of guerrilla warfare and its rapid transformation into a larger regional war. Part 2 segues into press coverage of the international dimension of the conflict. If in the late 1980s the conflict was mostly an internal Soviet matter, with the collapse of the USSR it was no longer so. What was initially a dispute within the Soviet Republic, then between 2 Union republics, had become an interstate conflict. The international dimension of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict also meant a new set of ground rules that involved a new set of international actors with clashing interests and political objectives. Covered in part 2 is also the interwar period, focusing mostly on the decades-long international diplomatic efforts led by the OSCE Minsk Group to resolve the conflict. So, at the time of this writing, the Second Armenian-Azerbaijani War over Nagorno-Karabakh has ended, but the conflict is still ongoing. Despite Azerbaijan's and Turkey's insistence that the status of the region is no longer an issue, the truth of the matter is quite different. It was and still an issue. What remains to be seen is whether it will be resolved anytime soon and whether the envisioned solution will be acceptable to both sides, as the Russian leaders have insisted. And with that, I would like to finish.
Thank you, Artyom, for that, for the introduction, overview, and presentation of the structure and basic thesis of the book. We will be getting to questions from the audience in a moment. I invite you to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And while that's happening, there were a couple of points and questions that I wanted to raise with you. That the fall of the Soviet Union is of course seen as a watershed event in the world and certainly in that region. I was wondering if there are nonetheless continuities in the coverage in the Soviet, Russian, and Russian press, or is the Soviet coverage of a entirely different kind than what would follow?
There are and there aren't. A couple of things need to be, when talking about the press coverage, a couple of things need to be kept in mind. During the Soviet Union, the press was, of course, under the domination of the Soviet Communist Party, right? So every article that was written, or pretty much every article that was written, would go through rigorous censorship, making sure that it was in lockstep with orthodoxy. Sorry. Apologies. Forgot to turn off my phone. So you had pretty much almost like a commissioned journalism. A journalist wanted to write something, and it was vetted. It needed to be aligned with the government's official view of things. I mean, some journalists could be freelancing, but at the end of the day, it had to go and remain within the strictures and the rigors of the orthodoxy. With the Soviet Union's collapse, you have a lot of independent newspapers coming along, and a lot of independent editorializing, not necessarily reflecting the view or the opinion of the government. But much like with the press in any other country, when it comes to foreign coverage of foreign issues, more often than not, the writing would defer to the official point of view. I mean, this happens even with veritable American institutions like the CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post. When it comes to domestic coverage of issues, there is great latitude, right? Of what you can talk about and how you can cover it and how you can criticize the government. But when it comes to foreign policy issues, especially that is extremely important to the government and government's foreign policy objectives, more often than not, the views of the government get reflected in the press coverage, in what the journalist chooses to write or what the commentator chooses to make a comment upon. Much like Bernard Cecil Cohen was, the small passage that I quoted. So there is a continuity, especially when it comes to tenor of some pieces. But there's also a great variety of voices that come along. But at the end of the day, even independent voices sometimes, not most of the time, but occasionally, enough instances that they would defer to the government's view of how things.
Similarly, I wanted to ask whether there has been a detectable shift during the Putin era, so-called, as opposed to the period before Putin had gained power or entirely consolidated his power.
There is a shift, actually. When I was thinking like if there was an image that I would use to describe the book and the collection of the articles, I thought probably the best description of the book, or looking at the Russian coverage of the conflict or the Russian coverage of the South Caucasus, the image that came to mind is a mood ring or a thermometer. It's like you can see the slowly changing mood in the coverage of the issue. From when the Soviet Union had just collapsed, the coverage was of somewhat a different tenor. And later Yeltsin years, when Armenia and Russia become ever more integrated militarily and so on and so forth, the tone changes, becomes more pro-Armenian, and there is more not anti-Azerbaijani, but critical of Azerbaijan's foreign policy objectives happening. So the mood, you can see the shift changing, and like you can look at the book and read the temperature almost as in a thermometer. how this mood is changing slowly. It's changing and changing until in the part where I talk where I've not talk about, but I put the Russian interests. The last article in the Russia section of the book is an article published in 2018 when Pashinyan has just come to power. And there's this Alexander Khramchikhin, who's a very well regarded, very well respected military political analyst in Russia, independent, but with good access to Kremlin and even him, who has usually tried to be this independent, level-headed voice presenting analysis on these issues. His article ends, and if you don't mind me reading, with sort of threat. Today, Moscow and Yerevan are in completely different geopolitical weight classes and consequently addressing issues on completely different levels. Therefore, cognizant and grown-up Armenians must take a sober look at things and understand who needs this 102nd military base more. This is a piece discussing this 102nd military base located in Gyumri, and the tone was already, the temperature was changing. The mood ring was changing its color from a cheery, rosy to something far more darker and sinister. So you can see these, things happening when you read the book and read the articles in the succession that I have put. You can definitely see that.
One of the questions from an audience member, Stephen Rake, this sounds like an invaluable collection of primary sources for both students and scholars. Of course, that's not a question, that's a statement, and I'm sure that that's true.
Thank you, Stephen.
Could you please summarize your main conclusions of the post-1991 Russian journalistic coverage of the conflict? What are your main takeaways from that large and diverse body of materials?
The main takeaway is this is unparalleled. To be honest, the level of knowledge of the region that the Russian journalists exhibit, whether some of them are biased or not, is a question of a different category. But their knowledge of the region is just so supreme and maintained and pointed that you cannot compare it with anything else. But the second interesting thing that the main takeaway from the book is how much Moscow fears of its fortunes changing in the South Caucasus. And I think not a whole lot of people appreciated that. Certainly not a whole lot of people appreciated that in Armenia. So when you read these articles, whether it has to do with the coverage of the Turkish interests in the region or the Iranian interests in the region or the American interests of the region, the enormity of this palpable almost fear that the Russian politicians and decision makers are showing, how the Western interests are making inroads, and how they're softening up the already soft underbelly that is the South Caucasus for Russia's political interest. That is probably the biggest thing. The phobias, the almost to the obsessive degree, the fear that South Caucasus would turn from a backyard, a Russian backyard, to something of a fortress for Western interests. So that is probably the biggest thing that is absolutely noticeable, and the biggest thing that I took away from it when I was putting together the collection.
As you say, this is Russia's backyard, and has been for a long time. So it sounds like what you're saying is both that the quantity of coverage is, of course, far beyond what one would find in the West and certainly in the United States, but also the quality and the depth of familiarity and understanding is is light years beyond what is seen for the most part in the Western press. One thinks of some of the coverage in the United States media of the war, and each time it feels like the author is, is describing another solar system that hasn't yet been fully charted by astronomers, and just feeling their way. Whereas for the Russians, I gather this is part of their regular beat.
Yeah, it is pretty much. I mean, the context that these journalists have on the ground, the stringers they employ, the travels, the frequency of their travels to the region. And of course, it helps that a lot of these papers, they have their own local bureaus. I mean, or somebody representing them or writing for them or working for them on the ground in the region. So access for them is not a problem. Regionally, they're pretty close. I mean, Moscow to Yerevan is 2.5 hours plane ride. So a lot of these issues, even logistically, is much more easier for them. And of course, the context within the governments in Armenia or in Azerbaijan or even in Stepanakert, some of these journalists travel there and spend some time there talking not just to the taxi drivers, but also to the government and so on and so forth. So their coverage is much more textured, much more nuanced. Again, we can talk about biases and so on and so forth. It's a different question altogether. But their knowledge of the region makes a lot of difference. So that's why it's supremely important to spend time there, to get to know the culture, to cultivate and so on and so forth, to do some ethnographic work, not just, read the Wikipedia or find an Armenian contact, make a phone call, and what's the Armenian street saying or whatever, So, and the Russians have been at this for a long time, and they're doing a heck of a job.
Now, I think maybe you have addressed this question from Ara Hagopian already in your remarks, but can you summarize Russia's press and specifically public opinion, which are maybe two different things, regarding the Karabakh conflict? Were they pro-Armenian or pro-Azerbaijani, or were they unbiased, nuanced, balanced, etc.?
Well, if the Russian public, by and large, really doesn't care. From what I've seen, public opinions, they could care less if the region is controlled by Azerbaijan or Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, I'll tell you in what sense I even say that. My wife is from Ukraine, and one time, me and my late father-in-law were having a conversation, and he told me that in 1980s, when he first heard about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, he thought that people living in Nagorno-Karabakh were not Armenians, but they were Karabakhzi. He thought it was a different ethnic category altogether. Ossetians lived in Ossetia, Abkhazians lived in Abkhazia, Azerbaijanis lived in Azerbaijan, Armenians in Armenia, and Karabakhzis lived in Karabakh. So the Russian public, I mean, their knowledge of the region, in terms of general public, I mean, of course, they're much more familiar with the region. They have met an Armenian or two, an Azeri or two, or a Karabakhzi or two. So the public is, when it comes to these issues, they're really probably disinterested in terms of the public opinion. Yes, there are more Armenian celebrities on the Russian TVs, but that hasn't translated into a popular support of Armenian issues by the population. They have other fish to fry, they have other worries to worry, and so on and so forth. When it comes to the newspapers, again, you have to differentiate. There are editorials, right? And anybody can write an editorial, and editorial policies of Russian newspapers, again, on these issues are more or less in line with the Russian official government position. But the coverage, the stuff that I've seen has been more or less neutral, except these editorial moments where you have an expert or an analyst writing with a different tenor, either playing it cute and nice, or sending warnings, and like Khramchikhin was saying that you have to make sure you understand that there are grown-up Armenians who are sober enough to understand that Russia ultimately doesn't care about 102nd military base, and it's more for Armenians' benefit, and so on and so forth. So there are the two types, right? There's the journalism that reports facts with little spin and interpretation, and then there is the editorials. And in the editorials, you have, I haven't done a quantity analysis to see are there more pro-Armenian editorials or more pro-Azerbaijani, but the general tenor of the coverage has been more or less neutral, more or less concentrated on facts, and more or less sort of making sure they understand what Russia or how Russia sees these events that develop in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh and in Azerbaijan.
Thank you. I'm sorry, you froze up there for 1 second. I hope they aren't cutting your bandwidth in Minnesota.
The temperatures are dropping. Maybe that has something to do.
A question from Armin Marsubian. Having yet to delve into the depths of the book, are there any Russian Armenian voices evidenced in the Russian press and represented in the book?
Oh yeah, that's one of the things is that am I freezing? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're freezing a little bit.
Okay, so one of the things about the Russian press coverage is that they employ Russian Armenian correspondents to cover these issues because of also linguistic stuff, right? Russian Armenians, more often than not, they would be probably speaking the language, and it doesn't hurt to have an Armenian last name, and that Armenian last name can allow them certain access to politicians or policymakers or local analysts. And the same with Russian Azerbaijani voices. Usually they have done a good job in terms of making sure that an Armenian covers Armenian issues for Nezavisimaya Gazeta or Izvestia or Pravda, or an Azerbaijani covers the Azerbaijani issues, and so on and so forth. So yeah, they employ a lot of Armenians. There are a lot of Armenian writers and journalists, and Azerbaijani writers and journalists. So they're sort of equal opportunities there. I wouldn't say one overwhelms the other, but yes, there are Armenian authors presented there.
Question from Misha Gerakoulis. Thank you for this excellent body of work. As a journalist and educator of critical media literacy, I've noticed the inundation of propaganda and fake news coming out of Azerbaijan. In 2020, a BuzzFeed reporter called out the Azeri administration's Facebook account, which was cranking out fake news, though it did not seem to have any bearing on the Facebook account. Regarding the temperature or mood in the media, have you noticed the Facebook effect on international coverage?
I haven't seen much of that. I probably, if I did just a second, let me do a Control F and do search in the text of the PDF and see if there's even the word Facebook in the text, because I don't remember even seeing Facebook or Twitter mentioned in.
Imagine.
Yeah, there is maybe 15 mentions of Facebook in 500 pages, and in probably, very few, 14 mentions of Facebook. So thankfully, it tells me that it hasn't had that effect on the journalism and the sources of information that they have employed in trying to formulate arguments or write about the conflict and so on and so forth. but it's a very, very interesting question.
Likewise, does the book take note of the Syrian war and refugee crisis and the potential effect on the Nagorno-Karabakh Artsakh conflict? Or the
Mark, can you repeat it? Because
does the book
something's wrong with the internet.
Does the book take note of the Syrian war and refugee crisis and potential effect on the media spin of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict?
Very little. I would say on the part that it talks about the Russian vector, very few mentions of Syria. At the very end, when in the book there is passages of the lead up to the war. There are mentions of Syria, but not greatly in terms of how that would affect one or the other. Yeah, thanks. Who was asking that?
That was Misha Gerakoulis. Alan Whitehorn asks, and this steps a little bit outside of the parameters of this book, maybe into the parameters of your next book, and maybe it will give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about that. Is there a prevalent current Russian contour for a suggestion of a solution to the South Caucasus conflict? It's a big question, yes.
It's a big question. That's the, I mean, in the introduction, I was saying that there is no neat blueprint, right? How Russia deals with the conflict. But, and this also harks back to Stephen Badalyan-Riggs' question about one of the overarching things that I've seen, is that when it comes to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, it's interesting, leader after leader from Gorbachev to Yeltsin, to Putin, to Medvedev, to again Putin. When it comes to the conflict, I mean, if you do a content analysis of the stuff they have been saying and of the stuff that the press has been writing, there is this linearity of they use almost the exact same verbiage. And in my mind, when I was collecting these articles, I was imagining that right before Putin is about to make a statement or is about to meet Armenian or Azerbaijani leaders, he goes to a safety box, opens up the box, gets out a set of words that he has to use with regards to the conflict. And this was something that they came up in 1980s, and that document hasn't essentially changed. So when you look at the Russian sort of perception of the conflict and the conflict settlement, there hasn't been much variation. And this sounds rather probably shocking to some Armenian members of the audience, because Russia has insisted from the get-go that the solution needs to be acceptable to both sides, that they will make sure that the solution is acceptable, and they will become guarantors. Now, what does that entail is probably the way the conflict or the war resolved itself is probably the way it has always been envisioned in Moscow. And this is the way they wanted to, for the conflict to develop, not to develop, but to be resolved in this way. And this is, in their imagination, probably the acceptable solution, that Nagorno-Karabakh remains Armenian or Armenian inhabited. The rest of the territories that were taken were given back to Azerbaijan, and the status will be left to future generations to decide. Nobody sort of wants to touch the issue of the status, because it is the apple of the discord, right? It's the quintessence of the thing. It's all about the status. In 1980s, it started as the issue of the status. The status is still unresolved, though Azerbaijan and Turkey insist that it has been resolved, right? So there are no contours. We can guess. We can sort of have an informed guess. And that's one of the reasons I actually wanted to put together this material in the book, to have this texture, to have this big understanding of what Russians have thought and what Russians have been thinking or are thinking about these issues, so that nobody has any illusions as to what Russia thinks. I mean, it's still, to quote the great Russian poet Fyodor Tyutchev, you can't understand Russia by mind alone. So you can understand Russia by mind and by this book.
It's a great contribution. So your next project, I take it, looks back further.
It does.
At the roots of the conflict. I don't know how far back, but maybe in conclusion, you can briefly tell us about the scope of this next work.
Well, it's going to be based on my dissertation, which I defended 10 years ago. And then I left the academia to do some consultancy for 4 or 5 years. So I never worked on the book, and I set it aside, decided that I'm done with the academia because academia was done with me. We weren't getting along well. And so and actually, one of the reasons this book came about is when I was writing my dissertation, I went to Armenia and to Stepanakert and extensively scanned newspapers and returned to the United States. And within a month, my computer had gone kaput and I lost all my scan. So this book sort of, brings, it's sort of a remedial project in that sense. But I look, and in my dissertation, and what I want to add is, I basically look at the rise of Armenian and Azeri identities. I look at the history and how religion contributed to the formulation of Armenian and Azeri identities, and the secularization of these identities in the Soviet Union, and how the recovery of identities involved bringing back religious, symbols and so on and so forth in both societies, in Armenia to a greater degree than in Azerbaijan. So I look at this and I look at it through a sociological and socio-historical lens, and I try to reconstruct, sort of create this textured background of the conflict and put it in sort of a longue durée context. Because, we can speak about the conflict in 1980s, which, right now we're living at the consequences of that. But there is a bigger context, there is a deeper context, there is a larger context, a larger pond, if you will. So I try to paint that context, and I try to sort of prime the canvas and put the context in that historical and social, put the conflict in that social and historical context. And also, at the conclusion, I would like to thank Eastview for making available all these databases and the team of translators that helped translate this material. And I'd like to thank them that they trusted me that I would be capable to pull something like this off.
Absolutely. Well, we're glad the project exists, the book exists, and really looking forward to your future work as well. And it's really great to have the chance to hear from you tonight, and to say we hope to be hearing from you more in the future. Maybe as maybe you and academia will get back on more familiar terms. But at any rate, we hope you will be on speaking terms with us all the time now and into the future. So thank you, Artyom.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you to the audience, absolutely, for your excellent questions as well, and for your attention. Thank you to the Society for Armenian Studies and the Gulbenkian Foundation for supporting Nasser's contemporary issues programming. And I bid you good evening. Thank you.